It's been over a month since my last update, and to say a lot has happened would be a fairly massive understatement. Between now and then, I published a video called The Dangers of Being Public, in which I said the following. Another example is that I'm not opposed to pivoting a game's direction if I feel it's necessary. With the upcoming demo for Project Breach, I feel that some people might misinterpret this, but hear me out. That's the whole point of a demo, to figure out what's fun, what works, and what doesn't. If it turns out that controlling pawns RimWorld style isn't fun for a tactical game, then I see nothing wrong with changing the game's direction, or even changing it entirely. The cool thing about building everything the way I have is that it's been all built very generically, which means everything I've made applies to all sorts of different games. If I decided the game was to be an RPG or a survival horror, nothing I've made so far would really need to change to accommodate that. I have an armor system. I have a weapon system. Most games would benefit from these things. No work will have been lost. The map editor, weapon system, even the enemy AI will be just as useful on any other project as it would be for this one. Now, I've often said I'm making an engine, not a game, but it was only while making that video I realized I had never really said it online. Even builds of the game referred to it as Perlinea Engine 3. So I kept working on the game, but it wasn't feeling any closer to being fun to play. I kept thinking that a tactical game like this just doesn't work with RimWorld controls because you need to be more precise with your commanding than that. So, I was faced with three options. 1. Scrap the engine. It sounds unbelievable, but after 3 months of work and the game still feeling like it wasn't coming together, this was pretty tempting. Also, the fact that I was working on a 2D game instead of one of those beautiful 3D ones I see all the other indie developers posting on Reddit. But I knew in my heart that the problem wasn't the engine itself, but rather the idea just wasn't working. So I was dedicated to using this engine no matter what. Option number 2, redo the controls. Maybe a Rainbow Six Siege style game but with top-down RimWorld controls just doesn't work. But perhaps with another control system it could. And option number 3, pivot the game. What if the player controlled a pawn like a normal person instead of an RTS, but leave all the other programming the same? I mean, it'd take me a while to program all the new systems for the player to use. I don't want them actually controlling a pawn, just controlling a body with systems similar to a pawn. But it seems like it could be fun. Any of these options was a major dedication that would require lots of work. But in the end, I went with number 3, and I'm very glad that I did. I started off creating a sort of horror-feeling map where you moved slowly and had a very limited amount of ammunition, but quickly I realized I wanted something more like a power fantasy. I also realized that the existing weapons and enemies were definitely balanced for an RTS-style game, and not for one where you could be controlling a player. So I deleted all existing weapons and enemies, grabbed some demon textures I just had laying around, and made a demon map. It was insane how well it instantly worked. It literally only took half a day to program a new AI script for the demons to use, a ranged demon enemy, a weapon for the player to use, and a map to test it all on. And after that went so well, I worked on the map some more, added a melee demon enemy, and here we are. It took about half a month to program a body for the player to control that had all the same systems as a pawn, like equipment, inventory, visuals, combat, movement, health, and a new camera. I could have potentially just had the player control a pawn as they already existed, but I wanted the player to use something completely separate, so that way they could be changed and polished to better suit a player's experience without affecting all of the pawns. This has meant that I've been able to more finely polish player movement in combat than what would otherwise be possible, and I think the positive feedback I've gotten from testers shows that it's worked. Now, I'm proud of how the tactical AI I programmed in the last update turned out. There's still some problems with it, but overall I think it works really well. But enemies that hear gunshots, investigate, take cover, it just don't match a game about killing demons. I remember watching an extra credits video about developing AI that best suits the game, which sometimes means having a few simple AI rather than just one big complex AI system. So I thought I'd do just that. After all, the enemies in Doom felt fun to play, and they were boiled down to wander in place, chase the player where we last saw them, and attack the player when we have sight. So I created my own pawn brain to mimic those behaviors. They don't wander yet, but after just implementing the last two, they already felt more fun to play against with this new style of game. This less complex behavior also means they're easier for the CPU to handle. I also didn't delete the old pawn brain, so I, or any modders, can use it in the future. So I'm definitely glad I had the foresight to write the system in a way that supported multiple brain types. Most of this new UI stuff speaks for itself from the previous videos, but just to summarize, there's a new player UI, weapon UI, and game cursor. But something I haven't shown you yet is the new engine error screen. Having all the game's default content be its own mod has let me see things from the perspective of potential modders. So from very early on, I've implemented systems for debugging what could go wrong with developing mods. For a while, those have just been restricted to error messages that wrote to the console, and I had every intention of just keeping them that way, and modders would just need to go check the game's player log to see what went wrong. But I decided it wouldn't take too long for me just to implement something easier for modders to see what went wrong, so I made the UI. It'll also serve handy in the future as being a pop-up for potential errors that could occur in the game. There's now a campaign file in the mod, so you can create your own custom campaigns too if you should choose. Campaigns can be a series of maps related to each other, a story, or just a pack of different maps. All you have to do is have a campaign name, a thumbnail for it to use, and then all you have to do is write down what maps it'll include in order. When the player launches the game, any campaigns that are loaded from mods will check if they have a save file, and if they don't, create one. Now that sounds simple, but that means the engine now supports saving player data, which is pretty cool. And now, another one of the really big changes. The map editor is now a separate application from the main game. This was necessary in order to implement campaigns. The problem before was that since the map editor was a part of the game, you couldn't cache maps because you had to assume they might be edited. But reading all the map files every time you need to access map data is extremely slow and led to opening the campaign screen taking about 5 seconds. Now that doesn't sound like much, but consider there were only about 6 maps in the game at the time. And as that number increases, it'll obviously get worse and worse and take longer and longer. So now maps are stored in RAM, cached, when the game is loaded so that their data can be quickly accessed in-game. Now, since I'm developing an engine more than just a single game, I've always taken the harder option among many easier alternatives. The engine didn't need to have multiplayer, which doubles development time, and I didn't need to make the multiplayer super secure by having it use the server-side model. It certainly didn't need to have mod support, which also massively increased development time. I didn't need to go as far with mod support as I did, etc. But I did it anyway, because this engine might be used for many games to come, and I want it to be the best that it can be. I was presented with this dilemma when I wanted to add a win trigger to the level. It would have been just really easy to program a collider that when the player touched it, it made the level end in victory, and then to just have the player place it in the map editor. But I'm so close to being done with most of the major engine features and being ready to focus on just the game, so why take the easy route now? And as a result, I've been working on a new major feature for the map editor, map events. I used to play a lot of Warcraft 3 when I was younger, and I loved using their map editor. The Warcraft 3 map editor included a map events system that sort of let you program events without actually writing any code. Now, I'm not going to make it quite as complex as theirs, I mean, I'm a one-man team after all, but having something like that in the map editor would let me and other map makers make truly unique levels with different events. Each map event boils down to having triggers and actions. The event which every map will need to add will be when the player touches an area trigger to make the level end with a win. Even though the map event system is complete, I haven't finished area triggers yet, which is a priority for my to-do list. So soon, players will be able to also complete levels using this system. This was of course a more time-consuming undertaking than I originally thought, mostly with figuring out how to get the data to save and load the maps properly. But I'm glad I went the extra mile to do it. Now with this game pivot, I saw a fantastic opportunity for improving performance. About 45% of the game's CPU usage was pawns trying to determine targets. 45%! Now that may sound like it's really unoptimized calculation, But it's, in my opinion, just a testament to how well optimized everything else in the engine is. It is, after all, having to do many line-of-sight checks, which involve physics and can be pretty expensive. Because it was such a major part of performance, I wanted to do something about it. But after optimizing it so much last update, I wasn't sure where I could really make any difference. But then I realized something. Because the game pivoted, I could make it so in the pawn file it was optional if pawns could target other pawns. After all, if a pawn solely exists to attack the player, why should it check if other pawns are potential targets? So, for each pawn, you can now configure if they're able to target other pawns or the player. So the question becomes, how much performance does this save? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Tests showed that when pawns were set to not try to target other pawns, their performance improved 256 to 161%, depending on, of course, on how many pawns the level contained. And that makes even more sense when you consider that because each pawn must at the very least perform a distance check to every potential pawn, and then do a line of sight check if they're close enough. That means the CPU usage of the pawn's combat system scales exponentially with the number of potential targets. And lucky for us, this also means that reducing the number of potential targets exponentially improves performance. This doesn't mean the engine can't handle pawns which target other pawns, it just means if you use pawns that do, you'll just have to use less of them in order to get the same level of performance. And lastly, this update was pretty massive and required a lot of work, but it's all really coming together. I've been letting some of my close family and a few other people play a test level I made, and the feedback has been more positive than testing I've done for any of my other games. It really makes me think I have something good going. There are two big things I want to finish before focusing on game content, those being finishing area triggers and adding a cinematics editor. The area triggers shouldn't take too much longer since I'm already pretty far with them. It's the cinematics editor that's going to be really time consuming. I want the game to be able to have cutscenes. This will be useful not for just when you're playing the level, but for the start and end of a level as well, maybe some sort of like introduction. I haven't decided how I want to tackle this problem and how in depth I want to go with such an editor, so I really have no idea how long it'll take. But it's another one of those things I know I don't need to make, but I feel that the engine could really benefit from, and since I'm so close to the end, I might as well uphold my record of going the extra mile. That's it for the major changes, but trust me, there were a lot more. You may have already noticed some of them, as there were many visual improvements to both the game overall, combat, and effects. If you want to know all of them, then be sure to read the full notes in the summary at the bottom of the blog, which the link is in the description. And as always, thank you for watching.